Okay. All right. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Ernie Daniels, and I'm the President and CEO of the First Nations Finance Authority. We are in Parliament Hill this week to urge Canada to embrace a structural change of financing infrastructure on reserves. An AFN report estimates an infrastructure gap between First Nation communities and municipalities at $349.2 billion. And this gap is increasing, not closing. This unreserved gap has developed over generations due to Canada's annual budget method, a cash spending approach. No level of other government uses this approach. I am joined this week by chiefs and councillors from communities in all provinces who want to begin the urgent task of improving life in First Nation communities. Today I'm with FNFA's board chair, Chief Warren Tobogganan, and FNFA Board of Director Vice Chief Patrick Courtois, who will be making remarks. I would also like to acknowledge 4 other FNFA board members in attendance: Councillor Christiane Jerome Bernard, representing the Micmacs of Giskek. Okay, I have a problem with that one. I apologize. Anyways, Chief Kyer Wilson from Long Plain First Nation, Stephen Johnston from Mistawash's First Nation, and Councillor Ryan Littlejohn of Ochese First Nation. FNFA is a federally created voluntary non-profit financial institution with 151 First Nations members across the country. We have provided close to $2 billion in loans to fund critical infrastructure and economic development projects. We do that by leveraging First Nations' own source revenues into debenture issues in the capital markets. We then relend these proceeds at rates far below chartered bank rates. But the simple fact is First Nations' own source revenues are not sufficient to close this gap that has developed over generations under Canada's policies. The time has come for Canada to do more. There is a solution, though, one that prizes partnership over paternalism and the colonial model of providing annual cash to communities that only support small building projects. It is called monetization. Build now at today's cost through debenture financing and repay over a chosen term. This is an approach used by the provinces and municipalities. We are asking Canada to commit to structural change, beginning with a pilot project. If Canada committed $200 million in its annual budget for the next 20 years, FNFA could issue a debenture of approximately $3.6 billion. These monies would build 12,000 homes or provide clean, reliable energy, or provide schools or health centers. The gap would start closing. In future budgets, this amount could be increased, ensuring the gap continues to lessen, not widen. Canada has committed to closing this infrastructure gap by 2030. It is now 2023. The time for structural change is now. Monetization is not a silver bullet. It will not close the massive infrastructure gap overnight, but we will have a fighting chance to limit the disparity in living standards that have existed for generations and continues today in First Nation communities. We will have an opportunity to right the historical wrongs. We want to seize the opportunity now. We cannot afford to wait another generation for economic reconciliation. So thank you. I'm going to call up our esteemed chair, Chief Warren Tobogganan. Chief.
Honey Bojo, it's a pleasure to be here. For those who don't know me, I'm Chief Warren Tobogganan of Wasauksing First Nation in Ontario. In 2021, the federal government pledged to close the infrastructure gap by 2030. Unless we start doing things differently, the gap persists will persist for decades and perhaps forever. And make no mistake, the potential impact of leveraging annual federal transfers instead of using annual cash budgets to build infrastructure is enormous. The FNFA has been leveraging own source revenue streams from the First Nations for years. As Ernie has said, we have achieved some positive results, but this can take us only so far. We will soon be at the limit of what we can achieve using those same revenue streams. Imagine the power of leveraging federal transfers for infrastructure funding. We could raise a lot more capital, and First Nations could start today on large projects that are so critically needed. As an example, if Canada was to set aside again the $200 million annually, starting with this budget, the annual investment leveraged over 20 years would allow the First Nation Finance Authority to issue a $3.6 billion debenture. That is enough to build 12,000 homes right now, rather than at an inflated cost of the future. That is just one example. Monetization could be geared to other major community priorities like safe drinking water and medical clinics that have not gotten off the ground. First Nations are also experiencing rapid population growth. They just cannot keep up in providing housing and critical infrastructure under this status quo arrangement with Canada. Aside from the positive impact on community well-being, any infrastructure improvements lay the groundwork for long-term economic growth. Already, the FNFA estimates to have produced nearly 20,000 badly needed jobs and have injected $3.5 billion into the Canadian economy. This proposed plan allows First Nations to think even bigger. Long-term planning, better buildings, and faster. We believe that when First Nations and government work together as partners, we have better results. We know this plan will work. It works in all non-Indigenous communities across Canada. And now that eventually First Nations will no longer be managing poverty, they'll be managing wealth. So again, I thank everyone. I thank certainly for the opportunity to share our story. I say miigwech. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Tobogganan. I'd like to now to call on Vice Chief Patrick Courtois.
Thank you, Ernie. Koikisinoichik. I'm Vice Chief Patrick Courtois from the First Nation of Pequot-Milnuts. The Pequot-Milnuts First Nation is based on the reserve of Mashtewayats in Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, a region of Quebec. It's a beautiful place. It's our home. But our community is facing serious challenges. While we have made some headway on several fronts in the last 2 decades, the current funding methods have made it impossible for us to provide our people with the type of accommodation and services that many Canadians take for granted, especially since our membership continued to grow following federal legislation that required it. Our First Nation has grown from 3,000 members in the 1980s to almost 10,000 members today. That's over a 250% increase. C'est un bel endroit. C'est notre maison. Mais notre communauté fait face à de sérieux défis. Bien que nous ayons progressé sur plusieurs fronts au cours des 2 dernières décennies, les méthodes de financement actuelles nous ont empêchés d'offrir à notre population le type de logement et de services que de nombreux Canadiens tiennent pour acquis. Notre Première Nation est passée de 3 000 membres dans les années 80 à presque 10 000 membres aujourd'hui. C'est une augmentation de plus de 250%. There's a critical lack of suitable housing, especially for young families and vulnerable people. Our seniors' home does not meet safety and health standards when it comes to adequate spaces, ventilation, or sanitation. This is unacceptable. Our shelters for seniors must absolutely be brought up to standard, and it must be expanded if we are to prevent our seniors from being moved elsewhere in the province for a lack of space to accommodate them. Notre foyer pour personnes âgées ne respecte pas les normes de sécurité et de santé en matière d'espace adéquat, de ventilation et sur l'aspect sanitaire. C'est inacceptable. Notre maison d'hébergement pour personnes âgées doit absolument être mise aux normes. Et il faut l'agrandir pour éviter que nos aînés soient déplacés ailleurs dans la province faute d'espace pour les accueillir. Another top priority is our high school. It's located in the former residential school, and that had a serious impact on attendance. Many of our parents prefer to send their children outside the community rather than deal with the terrible legacy of that institution. We need to relocate the high school and building a training center that can provide vocation training for our young students, but also adult education for those who had been impacted by the residential school system. We were recently forced to postpone vocational training in the field of construction for 22 of our young people due to a lack of available space. We cannot guide people to employability and healing if we don't have the infrastructure in place to support their education. That includes services that encourage community and healthy lifestyles like a youth cafe, space for organization to meet, a gymnasium that need renovation, and upgraded athletics tracks. We need clean water and better roads. We need to increase the capacity of our pumping station. And we need to rehabilitate some areas that are contaminated. Unless we invest more and do it soon, we risk losing some of our community members, and we will not be able to bridge the gap between our membership growth and our needs in public infrastructures to deliver the appropriate services. À moins d'investir davantage et de le faire rapidement, nous courons le risque de perdre certains membres de notre communauté et nous ne serons plus en mesure de rattraper l'écart entre la croissance de notre membership et nos besoins en infrastructure pour délivrer les services adéquats. We bring a native solution to a federally created problem. Why not being partners instead of being antagonists? Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chief Patrick Courtois. We'll now open it up to questions.
Hello, Brett Forster from CBC Indigenous. I take it this is something you've been advocating for quite some time, or at least some time. So what's been the holdback? What's the resistance you've encountered from the federal government to implementing this program?
That's a really good question. Yes, we've actually been at this for some time now. Goes back to probably 2016 when we first started this. I believe that the holdback is that the federal government at this point in time, and back then over the last few years, was not open to this change, this new way of funding infrastructure. The current cash-based method has been enshrined for this government for a long time, and one of the other the things that we hear from the various government departments that are responsible for this is that there's a lack of a source of funding. And then we talk to another department and they say, no, the funding is there. There just needs to be the will. And so that's what it's been lacking, the will to change this. We need someone to step up and make this change, which will make a great deal of change to our communities across Canada.
And as a follow-up, is this something you'd like to see included in the upcoming federal budget, a firm pledge to implement this program, or maybe amend your enabling legislation to allow for this kind of thing?
Yes, we are urging the federal government to consider starting a pilot project. We need to make sure that this can work through all the terms and conditions that government usually puts on different funding. We need to be able to see and to make sure that we have successful results so we can continue on. And yes, we think that our ask is to start on a smaller scale of about $200 million in the budget for the next 20 years, which will result in $3.6 billion in leverage financing, which we actually have access to the capital markets.
Fraser Neum for APCAN National News. Maybe you can outline still some of the challenges, though, that getting money from, for these projects from, is there a lot of capital available, or is that still challenging if you have some capital secured already, like from the federal government?
So the ISK has just over $2 billion budget for infrastructure right now, with an infrastructure gap of the numbers go from about 60 billion to the now 349.2 billion. It's not enough to close this gap in any way because the $2 billion mainly goes to a lot of upkeep of existing infrastructure, and it really doesn't address the new buildings that are required. And with inflation, it makes it that much more difficult. Now, with the monetization concept, is that the First Nation Finance Authority has the ability to go to the capital market and leverage a stream of revenue that can actually raise this capital. We've raised almost $2 billion already based on First Nations' own source revenue.
And I guess just to follow up on that, is there concern, though, that we've had some of the lowest interest rates historically over the past 20 years, but they're now going up, that the cost of borrowing won't last?
So the way the First Nation Finance Authority funds our First Nations with the access of funds from the capital markets, we do long-term fixed financing. So interest rates don't change for a period of up to 30 years in some cases. So our rate for borrowing is much less than the chartered banks. We operate in a different environment. We operate in much the same way as provinces and municipalities do. So our borrowing rate is probably about almost half of what the chartered banks would charge right now. So we're in about the 3% range, which I think is pretty acceptable now, and then for at least 10 years, up to 30 years. So interest rates are on the high side, but it's still at the same time, they're on the low side with what we're able to do. We have a AA rating from Moody's and also with S&P, and it makes it much easier for us to get financing at a much lower cost.